Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Finding Frogs Virtual Schools event. So this is our last Virtual Schools event for this year. So it's been very exciting. We've run so many different sessions over the last 4 terms. So we're finishing off today with Finding Frogs. And we're celebrating Frog ID Week, which is coming up in a few days. So please put I'm going to ask you some questions that you can put into the chat and put everything else into the Q&A. So we're going to be looking at how you can find frogs in your local area and how you can get involved with this great free citizen science project called Frog ID. And it's all about listening to the frogs that are around you. So maybe you can pop in the chat what frogs you have living near you. So it could be things that you've heard or things that you've seen, or maybe just frogs that you know that are in your area. So if you want to pop anything in the chat for me about the frogs that are found near you. So for me, I live in Sydney and I've got Perrin's tree frogs and I've got striped marsh frogs and I've got pet green tree frogs, which I'm going to show you in a little bit later. But the ones that I hear mostly, and they've started calling about a month ago, are those Perrin's tree frogs. And they are super, super loud. I'm just trying to change my view here. Excellent. So I think I've got the chat blocked. Apologies, everyone. I'll open that up for you now. So you can actually put your frogs that are living in your local area into the chat so we can get an idea of some of the frogs that live near you. But if you don't know what frogs live near you, hopefully by the end of the session today, we'll be able to find out. Oh, we've got Louth Public School has the green tree frogs, or we've got maybe Jaden saying he's only seen toads, black frogs, yellow frogs, and green tree frogs. That's a nice big variety of frogs that you have there. And green tree frogs as well. So the one I'm going to show you is a green tree frog, and it's got a really great call, like a rock, rock, rock. Occasionally when I'm calling, it might call back, but usually not. Oh, wow, at Louth Public School, we've got the Holy Cross frogs and bush frogs. Wow, that's an amazing variety. So Frog ID would be a great program for you as a school or individuals to get involved with as well, because you'll be able to record those frog calls, submit it, and it goes to the Australian Museum, and then they add that data to the distribution or the variety of frogs around Australia. So it's a great way of the frogs that you find being added to this amazing big data list. This is the 5th year of this project, so it's really exciting. But let's start off with what are frogs. So I'll just share my screen. I've just got to get to the right one. This is the one here. So what we've got is looking at a variety of different frogs that you can record. So it's the biggest frog count around Australia. It is free, and it's an app that you can download on your phone. It doesn't matter if you've got an iPhone or an Android phone, both work. And one of the best options is you can actually just add your location and search the frogs that could be near you. So even if you're not hearing frogs, you can still search them that way. And it's a way that we can understand how frogs are living in our local environment and where they are. Are they breeding earlier? Are they breeding later? The calls give us that information. So let's have a think about what frogs are. So one of the key features of the frogs are their life cycle. So you probably have seen tadpoles. Often people are seeing tadpoles more commonly than they are actually seeing the adult frogs, because a lot of the times the adult frogs are camouflaged and are really good at hiding. So what we've got here is our frog life cycle, our tadpoles moving into growing their back legs, then they grow their front legs, and then their tail actually sort of shrinks back into their body. an adult frog, and then it's when they are croaking. So when it's croaking, it's just the males and they are looking for a female. Essentially, it's calling out saying, I'm over here, I'm over here, I'm over here. But we've got some other really interesting features. So these are frog feet. You might just pop in the chat how many toes these frogs have on their feet. But we can also look at this amazing variety of webbing. Some frogs don't have webbing at all. Some have those round sticky pads on their fingers and toes. So some frogs are really well adapted to digging and burrowing. Some are adapted to living in close to water. Some are more adapted to climbing. So the ones with the sticky pads on their fingers and toes are great for climbing. But we have 5 toes on our frog's feet. Let's have a look at their hands. How many fingers do the frogs have? And again, we can see some big varieties in the shapes as well. Those sticky pads for climbing, very short hands here, better for digging, and a really big variety of colours as well. And if you look nice and closely there, we can see that they've actually only got 4 fingers. So that's a really big difference. If we think about us, we've got 5 toes, 5 fingers, but the frogs have 5 toes and only 4 fingers. And I want you to have a look here at the vocal sac. So this is how the frogs will make their call. But it's really interesting because it's a living part of the frog. It's not a separate part that just inflates like, you know, you're blowing a bubble if you're chewing gum. It is actually a living part. We can actually see those little blood vessels going through the frog to show that it's a living part of the frog. And it's a really important part of how they communicate during the breeding season. And I want to show this video here, and I just need to double check because I've got a feeling I might not have shared with sound. So let's fix that now. There we go. Hopefully the sound will come through. Just put it up if it doesn't. So what we're looking at is this particular frog here. It's going to bring air in its body, actually going to go into the body and then out into the vocal sac. So the vocal sac will never go flat. It will stay sort of puffed up. So let's have a look. So just let me know if that sound came through. We will play it again so we can see it, the air being pulled into the frog through the body and out to that vocal sac, and it's never actually going flat. But the interesting thing about frogs is all of their calls are different. Each species has a different call. So if we listen to another one here, this is also a great way to see some of those other body features of the frog. So they've got those large eyes, and the discs here behind their head are actually where they hear. So a little bit thinking of like an eardrum that's sort of vibrating. So instead of there having ears that stick out like us, like little dishes to catch our sound, they've got these sort of vibrating discs here that is where they hear. Now, this is a different frog. It will have a different call. I want you to, again, watch how the air comes into the body and then out to the vocal sac. So what a different sound this frog makes, almost like a beeping sound. I'll play it once more because it's quite an interesting sound. And if you're listening into the background, there's actually some other frogs calling as well. So often when we are out listening to frogs, it might not just be one species. So the most I've had in a call that I recorded was 4 different species of frogs. And it was when in summer up in the north coast of New South Wales. And it was 4 different species in that one frog call. Okay, let's listen to one more. This little frog's hiding. They've got a much shorter call. Its whole body is vibrating. as it pulls the air in to make that sound. So let's have a listen to some more. So these are some common ones, depending on where you live, that you might have heard or you might have seen before. So Frog ID has actually shown that one of the most common frogs around the east coast of Australia is this one called the common eastern froglet. Let's have a listen. So it's that front sound that's coming through. So the clocking at the back is a different species of frog, but it's that sort of chirpy sound that's coming through. Now, this frog is really small, only about 2 centimetres, camouflages in the grass really, really well. So they didn't realise how common the common eastern froglet actually was. Let's listen again. And maybe pop in the chat if you've heard this frog before. So this is one of my recordings recently from a flooded area. Oh, yes, we've got Stacey's class has heard that frog before. And we can see with that distribution map. So if we look at the map of Australia here, we can see that we've got the green section is where this frog would be found. So, and the calling period shows that this frog is actually calling almost all year round. So the peak is between February and November, but yes, it can still be heard calling between December and January. So there are some frogs that will call almost all year round, and often in during the day. So don't think you've just got to go out at night to hear your frog calls. It could be something you can hear in the afternoon. I do this with my family, doing Frog ID when we go camping in other areas, so we can find frogs that are different to the ones in my backyard. So this is the striped marsh frog. This is, again, another really common frog. Like the eastern, the common froglet, it is found in the ground. So these are the ones that you might hear in the grass. Often people find these when they're doing the gardening, looking at that amazing camouflage with the stripes, hiding in the leaf litter. Again, this one could be found almost all year round. The peak of its calling is now September to April, but it can sometimes be heard calling in the winter months as well. And it's found all the way down the east coast of Australia. This is one of my favourites, and we'll get everyone to maybe try it together. So whether you're at home or in the classroom, my way to do this, let me just, I'll stop sharing, to make this call is to put my tongue at the roof of my mouth and make a hocking noise. So why don't you all try that at home? If you're in the class, see how noisy you can be, because there's usually not one striped marsh frog, there's usually many. Okay, let's give it a go. So often this frog is sometimes called like a talking frog or a clucking frog because it's got that really interesting sound. Sometimes it's described as a ball being thrown at a fence and that hollow bouncing that comes off. So quite a common frog as well, certainly around Sydney and down the east coast of Australia. So let's listen to its call. Hopefully you made a lot of noise at home or in the classroom. Ooh. Let's share the right one. There we go. So let's listen to this one. So it's a really interesting sound. Just try and play that one again. So not what you would think as a frog. So sometimes the sounds that we're hearing in the evening or at night time, we don't think of frogs. We think are a different thing altogether. But sometimes they really are frogs. So that's why Frog ID can be great, because you can listen to all the frogs that could possibly be near you and see if you recognise any of those sounds. You can actually pull it up on your computer as well and listen to all of the calls and look at the photos and the distribution maps online without using the app as well. But if you want to record a frog and contribute, then you do need to record it through your phone. Let's listen. This is the green tree frog. A few of you had these living in your local area. Quite commonly calling, you can see across Sydney, northern New South Wales, most of Queensland and Northern Territory and Western Australia. It used to be a really common frog found in Sydney, but we tend not to find this one in Sydney and maybe in the outskirts of Sydney and beyond. I have these ones as pets, and I'll show you in a moment. So that's the green tree frog. I think it's a really classic sort of frog croaking sound. And they can get really big. This one here, if everyone puts your hand up, it's about the size of your hand. This is not my one. This is one from a great group of people called the Frog and Tadpole Society that around Sydney will actually rescue frogs that get moved maybe in fruit and veggie crates and end up in the wrong spot. And they will actually rescue them and find them happy, healthy homes. But the green tree frogs will eat anything they can fit in their mouth. And we can see how big that mouth is. Imagining if you put your hands where your ears are, that your mouth started there. That's how wide this frog can open its mouth and will pretty much put anything in that it can try to eat. And they will grow throughout their whole life. So most frogs will get to a certain maximum size, but the green tree frogs can get really big. This is the frog that I have living in my backyard called the Perrin's tree frog. And one of the ways that you can identify it, it's got this really beautiful cross shape in its eyes. It can change colour quite a lot. I've heard them sometimes called ghost frogs because they go almost white if they're out at night. They look really silvery. I've got one that likes to camouflage to look like my barbecue. So it goes like almost a greeny, rusty colour, but it also hides in my plants as well and looks a little bit greener. So they can change their colour slightly to reflect their surroundings. And yeah, pretty much spot on September, my parents' tree frog started to call. So let's have a listen to this one. I wonder if any of you have seen or heard that frog. As I said, that's the one that's common in my backyard. They are everywhere. I found them in my letterboxes. I found them in my ponds. I found them on my back window. So often they like my back kitchen window because if there's a light on, a lot of insects around the outside are flying around. So the frog goes to that area to try to eat that food. Okay, so let's have a little think about how frogs eat. Now, I've got some food here that I'll feed my frog. Now, unfortunately, when I zoomed into my frog before, it didn't focus very well. So I'm just going to see if I can get that focus sorted out while I try to get the food out without them all escaping. So the frog today is going to eat crickets. But as I said, they will eat anything they can put in their mouth. So some frogs are known to eat things like small lizards, other frogs, and those kinds of things as well. So generally speaking, they're very quick today and they're very small. So unfortunately, I've got very little crickets. They usually like slightly bigger food, but because of the weather, the crickets aren't getting as big at the moment. So let's have a look. I'm going to zoom into my frog. And we'll see if we can get it all focused and see what happens when they eat. There we go. So this is a green tree frog. It's actually a magnificent green tree frog because we can see it's got the white dots on it. Just want to have a really nice look at that face there. How big that mouth is. Just trying to make sure it's not too glary. If I can turn it up a little bit, we might even be able to see his feet. There we go. Putting his fingers and toes up. He likes hiding. and very different to the parent's tree frog that I showed you before with the cross-shaped eyes. The green tree frog has those sideways slit eyes. So frogs can actually be identified a little bit from their eyes. They can be identified by their colour, but the best way, as I said, is identifying them from their sound. Every species of frog has a different call. Okay, let's see if our frog is hungry. And what I would like you to look at is their eyes, okay? So even though this is a small food, I want you to see what happens to the frog's eyes when they eat. So could you see what happens? Maybe pop it in the chat to describe it. What happened to the frog's eyes when he ate the cricket? It closed its eyes, absolutely. Let's have a look if we can see it again. So frogs have very different mouth. Oh, he's going to open his mouth up for us. Or maybe we'll see if we can see his tongue. As I said, they're very little. So you probably have seen it on cartoons and things like that, frogs' tongues coming out. Now I'm just going to move off my frog. We'll come back in a moment. So think about your mouth. Think about that where your tongue is. So remember, our frogs, their mouth opens all the way from the side of their body, the side of their head, I should say. Ours is quite small. But also think about your tongue. So stick your tongue out. Where our tongue attaches is at the back of our throat. Think about swallowing. When we swallow, our tongue actually helps push our food down our throat. But frogs, their tongue attaches at the front of their mouth. So it does mean that they can stick their tongue out further to help grab their food. So if they're not quite the same way as cartoons, that it goes really, really far, but it can actually come outside to actually grab their food and pull it back in. But what it means is they don't have the same way as swallowing. So when we were feeding the frog, it needed to close its eyes, and as it pushes its eyes into its mouth or into sort of the roof of its mouth to help push that food into its body. So it's super weird, really different to the way that we do it, but they have that way of using their eyes to push their food in. So if they're eating really big food, now remember, I was only feeding them pretty small food. They were eating really big food. That really helps push that food back into its body. Now let's see if we can try one more time. We'll just have another look. There we go. We can see its hands. We can see the mouth. We can see those eyes closing to push that food into its body. It uses its hands to clean off any of the bits of food as well. So this frog here is probably older than all of you, 17 years old. So they can live for quite some time. So some frogs, generally the bigger the animal, the longer it can live for. You can see those ears on the side and how big the mouth is there. Those sticky pads on its fingers and toes, because this frog is a tree climber. Absolutely amazing. So I've had these, I've got 3 green tree frogs, and I've had them as pets for 15, 20 years. Now, in New South Wales, I need a license to have these animals as frogs, as pets, I should say. So I'm not allowed to go out and just collect frogs to keep as pets, I need to have a license to keep them and to get them from someone that's breeding them safely. Because there is unfortunately some diseases that are affecting frogs. And during this winter, we had quite a lot of frogs dying off, especially around Sydney. So they can be really affected by things like pollution, things like the floods as well, with lots of extra runoff entering our waterways can affect our frogs as well. So that's why Frog ID is so important, because we can then help map the current distribution or the area where these frogs are living. What they discovered recently is some frogs are actually starting to call earlier in some parts of Australia than they were in other parts, especially in some of these urban areas, which means areas where there are lots of extra houses, so in places like Sydney. So they are mapping where the frogs are living, when they are starting to call, and how long their breeding seasons are. So it's a really important way that even you can, any frog that you hear in your backyard or local area, that information can add and help this really big amount of data to help save our frogs and understand where they are and when they're calling. So let's have a look about what you can do in your own area to maybe encourage more frogs. So it might be that you have a dam near the school property or on your own property that you might be able to put some extra plants in that might help frogs, give them extra bits of habitat. So let's have a little look about some of the things that we can all do to help make frog-friendly environments. So this is that Perrin's tree frog that I talked about. This is my frog-friendly backyard. So you can see that real difference in colour. This one almost looks kind of a bit white with a tinge of green. I knew it was a Perrin's tree frog because it's the one that I find a lot, but it had that cross-shaped eye. Because a lot of the time I don't see them, I just hear them. We've got that amazing circle that's showing us these here, the sticky pads, which gives me a clue that this frog is a climber as well. So the plant that this one on is one of those, a big fern. So it's a nice area of my backyard that quite likes. It's near my barbecue, which is where he likes to hide as well. So by putting in plants that frogs can hide in, can be a really great way. One of the plants that frogs like a lot is these ones called bromeliads. You might have seen them before, that have almost little tubes in the centre, so they can hide in the centre of the plant where often there's a lot of water, and they can hang out in there, especially when it's hot. And when they make their big calls, it echoes. So they really like that as well, that they can make that echo environment to make their calls sound louder. So this is a frog pond in my backyard. So frog ponds can be any size and shape, and I'll show you some ones that are just made out of pots as well. So in this pond, I used some of the waterproof pond liner. If I made this pond again, I would have actually made it a bit shallower, but there was already a hole in my backyard, which is what I made the pond in. So you might see under the water, there's some rocks. So I've made lots of different heights in the water for frogs, because not all frogs are good swimmers. Frogs can actually drown. Even though they spend that first part of their life living in the water as tadpoles, when they are adults and they're no longer tadpoles, they're not always great swimmers. So being able to have things that they can climb out of is really important. So you can use sticks, rocks or bricks and logs to give them, and even water plants, to give them chances to get out of the water. You'll also notice that I've got some plants here that are providing shade. Frogs don't like to dry out, so they won't want a pond in full sun. So an area that's got a bit of sun and a bit of shade can be a great way to provide this habitat for your frogs. In here as well, you might just notice at the back here, these are actually little water snails. So they've come in on some of the plants, but eventually you'll get a whole habitat. So I tend to get a lot of dragonflies breeding and living in the water as well, and they can provide food for the tadpoles as well. So this is one type of pond, thinking about where you would want to put it. So one of the key things to start with is research. And again, Frog ID is a great way to start with that research. You can use the app or the web page to find out the frogs that live near you and work out what kind of habitat would be the best for those frogs. Because remember, not all frogs are going to live in a pond. So this one here is an above ground pond. So this is a big terracotta pot that I had, and I put a cork in it so it doesn't drain the water. And then I've got water plants, some bricks and logs in there as well. And we find some of the things like the striped marsh frogs quite like laying their eggs in raised ponds. But you could use a bucket. I've heard of the striped marsh frogs laying eggs in a dog's water bowl. So some frogs are not particularly fussy with where they want to lay their eggs. Other frogs are. So these raised ponds can be great because you could just put them out during breeding season, because a lot of people don't want ponds around the whole year because of mosquitoes and other things like that. So a little bit of a balance, an idea of where you might have seen or heard frogs, you could put some of these above ground ponds. Very simple, using a water tray or a bucket with some logs and some plants could just be enough to encourage some frogs to lay their eggs in that area. Another option is something like this. This is called a frog hotel. And what we've got, one of those plants called bromeliads that I mentioned before. In the centre here, it's a bit hollow where frogs can hide. Up the back, I put it in an area where I've got lots of other green plants as well. And what we've got is these tubes. So you can use bamboo, you could use hollow pieces of log, you could just use lots of different size bromeliads if you had them around. But I use different size pipes. I was able to buy metre-long pipes in different diameters, so different hole shapes, from my local hardware store, and cut them down to different shapes, different sizes, I should say. You can also do these just putting them straight in the ground as a big long tube, and then often they're called frog tubes. You can actually cut certain lengths and tie them to tree branches as well to give the tree frogs an extra place to hide. So these tubes are really good. A lot of frogs that are tree frogs like these habitats. When I was camping recently, way up in Queensland, there was a whole lot of metal poles around the campsite, and I could hear the frogs calling. And when I looked down, I could see that there were frogs hiding in those metal poles as well. So they really do like these tubes to make their calls a lot louder, and it gives them a bit of extra protection and security from predators as well. So there are a big variety of habitats that you can make depending on the type of frogs that you have in your local area. So just finishing off with some more information about Frog ID. So this is what the app looks like. It's very simple and it's free. That's the most important one. So you can encourage your parents to download it, and it's a great thing to do together as a family. And the reason why Frog ID is so important, it's, frogs are a great indicator about the health of our environment. So if frogs disappear, it's often the first sign that a particular environment is becoming unhealthy. So frogs help us test whether an environment's healthy. It gives us an idea what frog species are calling and when and where, how often they're breeding, how many different species are in an area, and in some cases, how many. Is it just one single frog calling in one area over and over, or can they hear many frogs of the same species, or many different species calling in the same area? So it's a really great report card on frogs and how they are going in the environment. So as I mentioned, you can get out there with your phone, do research of the frogs that are living in your local area to try to understand what habitats might be great. You might have a creek or a dam that is looking a little bit maybe it's been drying out, or maybe it's too flooded. You might want to build something next to that to give the frogs a little safe habitat because the dam might be too big for them. So you might have near your school a creek that maybe just needs a little bit of cleaning up. It could just be going out and doing a bit of a cleanup and removing rubbish and those kinds of things from the habitats you think the frogs would quite like. But also, you know, if you can't have a frog pond in your backyard or your school, listen out. You might have some of those tree frogs. So the frog tubes or frog hotels can be a great alternative to provide really safe habitats for your local frogs. So we have a few more minutes left over, everyone, if there are any questions about frogs. Otherwise, we will finish up in a few moments, and we might actually see if my green tree frog would like some more food. As I said, they're really tiny crickets. It usually eats things that are quite a lot bigger than that. So he's probably still quite hungry. So put your questions in either the chat or the Q&A if you want more information about frog ID or more information about frog habitats in your local area. Okay, so we've got from Narelle's class, how old can a frog get? So it really does depend on the species of frog. So as I said, the green tree frog could get up to 30 or 40 years old in captivity. Sorry, my cricket's just escaped. Oh, it's on the floor now. So they can actually live for quite a long time. So not all frogs live for that long. Some frogs, it's only a couple of years, but some frogs certainly can live for 20, 30 years. So some certainly you may be seeing over and over and over. So don't think it's just a seasonal thing. Many frogs can live for multiple years, and some frogs 10, 20, 30 years. What else can they hide apart from where else can they hide apart from leaves? So again, it depends on the species. So some of the ground frogs like the eastern froglet, striped marsh frog, spotted marsh frogs that like living on the ground. They could be in the grass, they could be in small shrubs around the base, leaf litter and those kinds of things would be where they live. Tree frogs are going to be found up higher, and they so higher up in trees or things that tends to be raised off the ground. But you also get some burrowing frogs that are actually going to be found sort of under the soil. How much shade do frogs need? It really depends. If you're in a really hot area, you might want to provide a little bit of extra shade, but it's usually the idea that it's a bit of both. If you've got a pond, if they've got some vegetation over the top that will provide some shade, the frog could move from a sunny area to a shady area, depending on where it would like to live. There we go. And what are some of the different things that frogs will eat? As I mentioned, pretty much anything they will put in their mouth. So a big frog, like the green tree frogs, could eat small lizards, other small frogs, even small mice, and those kinds of things. So as a general rule, they are more sort of insecty invertebrate eaters, but a big frog can certainly eat bigger things. So big spiders, praying mantis, grasshoppers, anything that it can catch and shove in its mouth, they'll give it a try. Sometimes they have to spit it out because it's just too big, but they will try. I've had great questions there from your class. How long do green tree frogs live? Yeah, so these are some of the longer living frogs in Australia, and I certainly know of one that's over 30 years old. Mine are almost 20, so they can live for quite some time. What is the frog where they have the black and yellow? So often that's the corroboree frog, the real key ones that have that yellow and black colour. They're found up in the snowy mountains and they're quite endangered. So I think Melbourne Zoo, Taronga Zoo and a few other places are doing breeding programs and releasing them back into the wild. And they are actually using the frog calls of the corroboree frog to identify how many are out in the wild. But that frog is really, really small. So if you actually hold up your thumb here and just look at your knuckle to your fingertip, that's how big a corroboree frog is. It's probably even a little bit smaller than that. So some of them are very, very small. And how long can their tongues be? It is related to how big they are. So a green tree frog, I've seen their tongue come out, a few centimetres. So it's not that sort of cartoon length that you see in movies and cartoons, but it can actually extend out. So I'm not 100% sure, because it's so quick when it comes in and out, but it can extend a little bit. And different species probably have slightly longer tongues, but it's relative to their body size. So a really small frog would have a smaller tongue. Okay, great questions, everyone. I'll just see if any more pop through. while I go to my green tree frog and feed it one last cricket. So I have to give the rest of the crickets to the other frogs. But usually what I would do is I've got what's called a terrarium. So it's got a sort of a fake rock wall, some plants, a little pond in the middle, and I just put the crickets in and they move around, and then the frogs will sort of chase them depending on how hungry they are. So let's see one last one. He's right in the front of a sticker. Let's see if I can move them around. That's better. Oh, there we go. You can see sometimes using their hands a little bit as well. Really great shot of the eyes just closing there. So frogs are an amazing species to have in your environment. As mentioned, quite key indicators of the health of an environment. So creating frog habitats and encouraging frog species into your local area is fabulous. And, you know, what they have discovered with that fabulous program called Frog ID is that there were some frogs that they thought were one single species, but because of their calls and follow-up research, they've been able to identify as 3 different species instead of just one. So Frog ID really is helping us understand more about frogs and actually identify new species. So I think now they're up to 245 species of native frogs living in Australia. The only species of toad that we have is the introduced cane toad. And that sound of the cane toad is also in the app. And it's really important if you do hear a cane toad in an area that they haven't been known to be before, they can actually get reported, and then they can be either collected and moved, so you don't get new populations of cane toads. So even if you hear something that's a surprise, you can move them on to new areas and they can be reported. We've got another question about how many kinds of tree frogs are there? Oh, that is a great question. There are a lot. So out of that 245 species, you know, a good, I'm just going to make a guess, maybe a third would be tree frogs. But again, you can search that kind of information up on the Frog ID app, because it actually will let you break them up into different types of frogs and different groups. So out of frogs, there are sort of separate different families. Some are the burrowing frogs, some are ground frogs, and some are the tree frogs. So different frogs in different groups, but they're all classified as frogs because of their body shape, the life cycle as well. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I will be sharing a copy of the recording and some follow-up information about how to build a frog hotel and how to make frog-friendly environments, and also a link to Frog ID so you can get involved in either just using the fabulous online resources. There's lots of different activities there as well, but also getting involved in Frog ID Week that is coming up on the 10th of November. So just around the corner, well, starting very shortly, and you can all get involved with that program, and it's all free. So thank you, everyone. Look forward to seeing you for other programs. I think we've got some free programs coming up in November on the 14th and the 25th of November for ClickFest, which is just another set of free video conferences coming up that we're putting on. And we've got free video conferences coming up for Coast Care Week. So please feel free to join us for those. We'll be sharing more information later on. So thank you so much to everyone for being part of the first year of the virtual schools events. It's something that we've been trialling. We've had almost 2,000 students participate in over 20 sessions. So it's really been wonderful to share such a big variety of programs with you. And thank you so much for being involved. Look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you, everyone, and bye-bye.